perhaps to some extent, degrees of sustainability.
Malcolm, could you please enlarge your presentation?
I'm just, yeah, there it should be now.
Yeah, that's better.
Okay. So this first slide, to some degree, was going to repeat what Valeria said in her introduction. So we will skip that here. And obviously, this is going to rely very much on what we might call a post-Keynesian, or perhaps more actually a post-Kaleckian macroeconomic approach. I wanted just to say a few kind of preliminary remarks which lie behind this. I think the first one, in terms of thinking about this, was really the idea that obviously if there's going to be zero growth from a post-Keynesian perspective, there has to be zero growth of demand in a demand-led economy. But unusually, we are looking at this in the context where there's a sort of if you look at it as a requirement for zero growth, this requirement is coming from obviously environmental and considerations and so forth, but the economy itself would in some sense still be capable of growing at a faster rate. It may, because it would bring lots of environmental damage and eventually it would run out. But it seems to me that over the next, say, 20, 30 years, the economy could grow from a supply side point of view much faster. So there is the notion that the demand, of the growth of demand, has to be constrained in order to fit in with the requirement for zero growth. So that I think behind that is partly that there will be, and this maybe relates a little bit to Eckhart's discussion about the expected rate of growth, because in some sense, over a considerable period of time, the experience of growth will be positive. So in that sense, the expectations about growth may well remain positive, yet those expectations have to be ground down to zero in order to lead to the zero growth economy, that net investment being zero. So how is that going to come about? And one of the questions I raised, although I haven't got any answer to it, is how is that going to be brought about? What government actions, in effect, or what social actions are going to be necessary in order to bring down the expectations about growth to zero, or whatever is going to be consistent with the zero growth economy. The second point I want to raise, and again, this doesn't, it comes in a little bit into our, or may come in a little bit in terms of our analysis a bit later on, is in a sense, is the zero growth economy a stationary economy? And by that I mean, by a stationary economy, I mean one which is in some sense almost like repetitious. What happens next year is the same as what happens this year. And there's very little kind of churn or in the economy. Now, in some sense, this probably doesn't come in all that centrally, but when we start thinking about things like the rate of interest on loans, what would be the rate of investment? What allowance do we make that there will be firms which will be dying, other firms which will be born and growing, and how is that? How are the resources switched from one to the other? So what what we're wanting to look at then is some of the aspects of this post-Keynesian analysis. So that there just summarizes the elements that you might expect of a post-Keynesian analysis. And Giuseppe and myself do have a paper which is still in draft form, which has a more formal model of some of these issues. One other point to make by way of introduction is that the move to a zero growth economy clearly would require or likely to require net investment close to zero. But it also would involve, I presume, reductions in growth promotion expenses, advertising, some activities of the financial sector. So if we're starting off with zero growth from a particular level of GDP, then there will be some transition to a much more consumer-orientated economy, in effect, so that the level of consumption or consumer expenditure would be a much higher proportion of GDP. Now, that's been in our analysis implicitly, we start from some particular level of GDP and assume the switch has taken place away from investment and towards consumption. But clearly we can repeat the analysis and start from a case where consumer expenditure itself is at a set level from which that starts. Now, a bit later on, if I have time, we'll get onto this aspect of if there is a particular level of output and indeed employment, particular level of consumer expenditure from which this zero economy starts, to what degree is that going to be what I would call acceptable to people? To what degree will people still would want to increase their consumption or increase their employment? And insofar as they do that, what are the consequences of that? Now, I think one of the I suppose the particular issues which come out of this, and indeed any, in one sense, a moment's thought will suggest that if you start from a post-Keynesian analysis which emphasizes the role of investment in driving demand and has differential propensities to save out of wages and profits, you're soon going to arrive at something rather like the so-called Cambridge equation. The Cambridge equation, that the rate of profit is the rate of growth divided by the propensity to save out of profits, is set in a closed economy without government and with zero worker savings. Now, if we introduce some of those elements, whether it's government deficit, whether it's some savings by workers or dissaving by workers, then clearly one gets a somewhat different relationship, but there is still a relationship which indicates that the rate of profit and the rate of growth will be positively related, and hence a much lower rate of growth would likely involve a much lower rate of profit. If we took the Cambridge equation kind of seriously, this is the rate of net profit, I should say, but clearly a zero growth economy would involve a zero net rate of net profit. If, as, and I think Eckhart, part of his presentation, hinted at this, there are, I think we know, there are various ways in which the zero outcome for the rate of profit, because it can be avoided by, for example, allowing for a budget deficit would be one way, although then that leads into issues about whether that budget deficit in a zero growth economy would be sustainable over time. And we know the argument that if there is a propensity to save out of wealth, and if wealth is constituted from the issue of government bonds, then as the government debt accumulates over time, then the dissaving out of out of wealth will rise, but then at the same time that will bring down the need for any budget deficit. But I think I would just want to make two points about this. Firstly, it is likely, it seems to me, highly likely, that the rate of profit would be much lower under a zero growth rate than under present conditions. And so, although we may want to move away from the extreme case of the zero rate of profit, it would be a very much lower rate of profit. And that raises many of the same issues about the sustainability of capitalism. In effect, can you have a capitalism which has a very low rate of profit, and what are the resistances going to be to that? And secondly, although there were conditions under which the rate of profit would not go would be positive alongside zero rate of growth, are there any market mechanisms, call it, or automatic mechanisms, which would bring those conditions about? So although we may want to move away from the slightly extreme case of the rate of profit being zero under zero growth, there are still, I think, major issues major questions which arise. And that slide just says the points I made before. And one of the issues I think one can raise out of this is what is going to be the role for what might be called not-for-profit organizations, whether it is mutual organizations, cooperatives, and so forth, which may require that they pay what is the equivalent to a rate of interest on the funds which they use, and they would require to be presumably to have a markup which is sufficient to cover depreciation. Nevertheless, one could envisage that there would be a much lower rate of profit, what would appear as profit, with not-for-profit organizations. In the paper, we do go on to the next section is talking a little bit about the monetary imperative for growth, but I think many people have covered this, and in partly interest of time, we'll just skip over that here. The second set of issues we want to raise is to look at issues to do with employment and unemployment. Now, in the model which Giuseppe and I have, which is a very, very kind of simple post-Keynesian model, one can secure full capacity utilization, provided that there is effectively a budget deficit, that the level of employment would on the one hand be demand determined, as usual, but also reflect, I cited the argument that in a zero growth economy, they would be starting from a particular level of output and employment. Now, in a sense, one can work back and say, well, given that level of output, and given the corresponding, so there's a corresponding level of employment, at least in terms of employment hours, and for partly reasons of simplicity, we treat an employment hour as an employment hour, but we at least could indicate what the requirements would be for the amount of employment hours to be worked in order to produce the level of output, which is the starting point in terms of zero growth. So the potential level of output and thereby of employment is, in that sense, historically determined. And then there's a combination of the average annual hours worked and the length of the working life, which would be compatible with that predetermined level of employment. Now, in the context of a zero growth, well, we may want to start to discuss what would be meant by full employment in this sort of situation, because in a sense, what we would be putting down is that full employment, at least collectively, would be where the number of hours that is compatible with this predetermined level of employment was actually taking place. Now, there's clearly issues we could, in terms of legislation, in terms of the length of working life, or legislation in terms of the hours worked, may be set down, or maybe more social norms about what is the average the hours to be worked each week, or what is the length of the working life. But whilst there may be legislation, or maybe social norms, are those norms and legislation to which people would adhere? If the length of the working life is laid down as being 40 years, there are people like myself that insist on working for 50 years or 60 years. And so that so would there be a push whereby people like myself to work longer hours than would be that would be compatible with this predetermined level of employment? Now, obviously, from one point of view, many argue promoting things like zero growth on the grounds that it could lead to shorter working time and so forth. Now, if there are people, again, like myself, that don't accept that, as it were, what will the effects be? And now another way of looking at it could also be that in our modeling, as generally in post-Keynesian economics, the driver for demand is largely investment. So it's the drive to accumulate. It's accumulate. And so the driving force behind growth, from that point of view, is the drive for investment and accumulation in search of profits. And much of our emphasis is on other ways in which that level of investment can, in some sense, be restrained in order that it comes down to net investment, which is at zero and zero growth. However, if there are, as it were, residuals of those who wish to increase their consumption and are willing to do so by working, will that then be a continuing drive for growth? Now, you could say that people may wish to work longer, but of course that may, it's no good wanting to work longer if nobody will employ you. So the supply of labor may be greater than the demand for labor, and so there's no that supply of labor does not actually become effective. But if there are ways in which, for example, the government is going to actually, through a fiscal policy to support employment, then if those want to work more, then to what extent will the demand be forthcoming for that? Or to what extent, if some wishes to work more hours than is the social norm, is that going to displace those who are not working for the social norm, only wish to work for the social norm or less? So I think there's an issue about the sustainability from an employment perspective, and that will get us into issues about what is going to be the driving force for people's consumption and their ability to work more than might be the social norm. So I think we would be, I know we haven't gone into this very much, but there's also having to perhaps reconsider what is going to be meant by full employment in this sort of context. Okay, this makes the points I've already been making. Jan, could you remind what time I started?
You still have 7 or 8 minutes.
Right. Okay. I just want to raise some issue, and we haven't, I have to say, thought too much about this, but it's about the rates of interest. I think much of what Eckhart and Valera were talking about, perhaps related to the rate of profit, and I want to say a bit more about the rate of interest on deposits and the rate of interest on loans, and whether they would become to zero, or not, or what they might be. Now, the rate of interest, I use the term rate of interest on deposits, meaning rate of interest on bank deposits, but I take that to be rate of interest on a range of, say, government bonds and other ways. And if we take the case that, in effect, in a zero growth economy, net savings would become close to zero, at least clearly there can be some cases where the government runs a deficit which enables people to save more than is going into investment, and that leads to, if we treat government bonds as net worth, then wealth would continue to rise and savings would continue to rise. But I really just want to point to what in some literature is what is called the fair rate of interest. That is the rate of interest which in real terms is equal to the rate of productivity growth, as put forward by, I think, Passanetti and others. And the idea that under a fair rate of interest, it's fair in the sense that the relative value of savings, in a sense, is preserved. So if you put in 100 euros now, then in 5 years' time, you get out 100 euros plus 5 years rate of interest. But if the rate of interest is at the rate of productivity growth, then that will have maintained the value of your savings and wealth. Now, insofar as something like the fair rate of interest has to apply to particularly pension arrangements, whereby the amount which those in work are putting in is equal to the amount which those who are retired are getting out, then the rate of interest, so far as pension provision is concerned, has to be, again, basically zero. So under some sort of life cycle hypothesis from the savings point of view, then the rate of interest in the real rate of interest under zero growth would basically go to zero. Now the rate of interest on loans, we would argue on the whole could still be positive in terms of the rate of interest on loans, taking account of credit, taking account of default risk and so forth. Now, this in part goes back to the question I raised about how does one envisage a stationary economy? Because if there's no, as it were, churn of firms taking place, then each firm is reinvesting its depreciation, and that's it. But if there are rising and falling of firms, and so there are loans taking place, then that presumably has some of those involve some degree of risk, default risk. And on that basis, the rate of interest on loans, also from a rationing point of view, could be positive. The fourth part is just to make some preliminary remarks about productivity and innovation. I think we'd first argue that it's still likely that there would be some growth of labour productivity. It may be relatively low compared to now, but insofar as there still remain to be elements of what sometimes called learning by doing, but in this case, we're learning by repetition, but still, insofar as there's an element of learning by doing. I remember many, many years ago listening, I think it was Nicholas Cowdell, who claimed that learning by doing had been going on for 2,000 or 3,000 years and had been going on at maybe 0.1, 0.2%. And so, but it's, I think, still some possibility of labour productivity rising, albeit at a relatively small rate. But I think much more, perhaps seriously, is to what degree some forms of research and development would continue. If there's some, which would in a way be part of almost like learning by doing. How could new processes and so forth be developed? Now, in one sense, in this sort of context, the answer to rising labour productivity is clearly very straightforward. That is, there's a comparable reduction in working time, and that's compatible with zero growth and what happens. The other side is how far research and development could not only would continue, but also would be directed much more to improvements in human welfare rather than leading to growth in GDP. Now, again, I don't have any very obvious answers to how this would come about, but it does seem that this would be one aspect of where a zero growth of GDP does not imply a zero growth of human welfare. We know all the problems to do with the measurement of GDP in terms of any notion of economic welfare.
Malcolm, time is almost out. So 2 minutes.
Yeah, I may not even need that. So how far can research and development be focused on, for example, medical advances, which themselves would, we hope, improve human welfare, economic and social welfare, but may not themselves actually add in any way to GDP. I think if you invent a drug, which is some sort of miracle cure drug, then the implementation of that may well be lower GDP, insofar as the production of the alternative treatments would count as part of GDP. The miracle drug would may become at lower cost and could involve lower GDP, but obviously could improve human welfare. So although this is a bit outside of the macro modeling, is to think how would these sort of activities continue, or would they be able to continue under zero growth, and what would they mean for the development of human welfare rather than the growth of GDP? So I think I'll stop there.
Okay, thank you.